Welcome to Whispers of Dharma, where stories of karma, compassion, and rebirth are softly told to heal the soul. The old grandfather clock in the corner, tick-tock, tick, each second marking another moment of guilt I carried for 27 years. A single candle flickered on my kitchen table, its flame dancing though no wind stirred the air. The incense I'd lit hours ago, sandalwood and jasmine, still curled upward, like prayers I'd never learned to say. My hands trembled as I held the letter. The return address, a name I thought I'd buried with my childhood. Mrs. Chen, the woman who left my mother when she needed her most. And now she was asking me to come home. But here's what I didn't know then. Karma doesn't just punish. Sometimes it brings us exactly where we need to be to learn what we've forgotten how to feel. The train pulled into Millbrook just as the evening mist began to settle over the valley. This small town where time seemed to move differently, where every brick wall held memories that refused to fade. I stepped onto the platform, my breath visible in the cool autumn air. The station looked exactly as it had when I was 7, when I last saw this place, when everything fell apart. The sound of my footsteps echoed against wet cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 8 times, and with each chime, I felt the weight of unfinished business settling deeper into my chest. Mrs. Chen's house sat at the end of Maple Street, behind a white picket fence that had seen better days. The windows glowed yellow against the gathering darkness, and I could smell wood smoke drifting from the chimney. But it wasn't just smoke I smelled. It was the scent of something ending, and something about to begin. I was 7 when Mrs. Chen became part of our lives. My mother, Sarah, had been diagnosed with lupus, and the treatments, they left her so weak, so fragile. Mrs. Chen lived next door then. She was in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and hands that always seemed to know exactly what to do. She would bring soup on Tuesdays, help with my homework on Thursdays, and on Sundays, she would braid my mother's hair. Family isn't just blood, little one, she used to whisper to me while my mother slept. Sometimes it's the people who choose to love you when loving becomes difficult. But then came the diagnosis, stage 4. The doctors said my mother had maybe 6 months, maybe less. I remember the night I found Mrs. Chen packing. Through my bedroom window, I watched her folding clothes into suitcases, her movements quick and nervous. She promised, I whispered to the empty room. She promised she would never leave us. But by morning, she was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty house next door, and a little boy learning that promises sometimes break like hearts. My mother lived for 3 more years after Mrs. Chen left. 3 years of struggling alone, of appointments I was too young to understand, of nights when I held her hand and promised I would never, ever leave. She died on a Tuesday, the same day Mrs. Chen used to bring soup. I found the first letter from Mrs. Chen when I was cleaning out Mom's things. Then another, and another. Dozens of them, all unopened, all marked "Return to Sender" in my mother's careful handwriting. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Mom died, it was different. The envelope was worn, as if it had been handled many times, and inside, in Mrs. Chen's familiar script, "Sarah, I know you may never forgive me, but karma has taught me something I should have learned long ago. Love doesn't mean staying when it's easy. Sometimes it means leaving when staying would hurt more." At the bottom, an address and a phone number, and 5 words that changed everything. I never stopped loving you. Walking up Mrs. Chen's front steps felt like walking through water. Each movement deliberate, heavy with the weight of 20 years of unanswered questions. I raised my hand to knock, and the door opened before my knuckles touched wood. She looked older, of course. Her hair was completely white now, and her hands that I remembered as so strong, they shook slightly as she reached toward me. "David," she breathed. "You came. I came to understand," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "I came to know why you left her, why you left us." Her eyes filled with tears that caught the porch light like tiny stars. "Come in," she whispered. "Come in and let me tell you about compassion and the hardest choice I ever had to make." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and old books. Every surface held photographs, and in every single one, there was my mother, laughing, smiling, alive. "I never forgot her," Mrs. Chen said, following my gaze. "Your mother didn't want you to know," Mrs. Chen began, settling into a chair that faced the window where she could see the house where we used to live. "About my diagnosis." The words hit me like cold water. "Your diagnosis?" "Alzheimer's, David. Early onset. I was 53 when the doctors told me my mind would slowly disappear." She reached for a photo on the side table. My mother, myself as a child, and Mrs. Chen, all 3 of us building a snowman in our backyard. My mother was starting to forget things, small things at first, where I put my keys, what day it was. But then I started forgetting how to help her take her medication safely. One morning, I gave her the wrong pills, double the dose. She didn't tell me until later that night when she started having heart palpitations. We had to rush her to the emergency room. That's when I knew that staying, loving her the way I wanted to love her, would eventually kill her. And forgiveness isn't just something we ask for. Sometimes it's something we give ourselves permission to leave. "But the letters," I said, my voice breaking. "All those letters she sent back." Mrs. Chen stood and walked to an old wooden chest by the window. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all addressed to my mother, all in my mother's handwriting. She sent these to me, Mrs. Chen whispered, every month, for 3 years. And Karma made sure I was still coherent enough to read every single one. With trembling hands, she opened the last letter. In my mother's careful script, Margaret, I understand now. Love isn't always about staying. Sometimes love is about trusting someone else to know what's best. I forgive you. I forgive us both. She died 2 days after I received this, Mrs. Chen said. And I've spent 20 years wondering if you would ever understand what I couldn't explain to a 7-year-old boy. The room fell silent except for the ticking of that old clock. Outside, the mist had turned to gentle rain, pattering against the windows like whispered confessions. I looked at this woman who had loved my mother, loved us enough to break her own heart, and mine, and my mother's, to keep us safe. The hardest part of compassion, I said slowly, the words coming from somewhere deep inside me, isn't forgiving others. It's forgiving ourselves for the choices we thought were wrong, but were actually love. Mrs. Chen's tears fell freely now. She taught me that, she whispered. In her last letter, she said that healing doesn't always look like staying together. Sometimes it looks like letting go, so the other person can find peace. I reached across the space between us and took her hand. It was warm, real, still capable of love even after all these years. Maybe this is what rebirth really means? I said, not coming back as someone new, but learning to see the same story with different eyes. As I stood to leave, Mrs. Chen pressed something into my hand, a key, old and brass, worn smooth by countless touches. This was your mother's, she said. She gave it to me the day before I left, said it was to the memory box she kept in her closet, said someday, when you were ready, you might want to see what she really thought about everything. I drove back to my mother's old house that night. The new owners had kept it exactly as she'd left it. In her closet, behind winter coats that still smelled like her perfume, I found the box. Inside, hundreds of letters she'd written but never sent. To Mrs. Chen, to me, to herself. And the last one dated the day she died. David will understand someday that karma isn't punishment. It's love taking the longest possible route home. Margaret chose the harder path so I could find the easier one. And someday, he'll understand that some angels look like abandonment until you see them with the eyes of forgiveness. If you believe that karma always guides us, please subscribe and leave a reflection so we can awaken together. This is Whispers of Dharma. Every story is a seed of wisdom. See you again in the next whisper.